There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a place built for people, but emptied of them. Not the silence of land that was never touched, that has its own texture, indifferent and ancient. This is different. This is the silence of furniture still arranged for guests who never came back, of roads paved for traffic that stopped arriving, of churches with hymnals still open to the last page anyone turned to. That's the silence we're walking into today. A string of islands across the Pacific where entire populations were moved out, by force or by necessity, and never moved back in. This isn't a story about natural disaster wiping a place off the map. These islands are still there. You could sail to most of them this week. The buildings are still standing, weathered but recognizable. What's missing isn't the land, it's everyone who used to live on it. So why does the government empty an island and then simply leave it that way? To understand that, you have to understand what these islands were used for, and by whom. Start with Bikini Atoll, in the Marshall Islands, because it's the case most people have heard of without quite knowing the details. In early 1946, the United States Navy approached the roughly 167 residents of Bikini with a request dressed up as a question. The residents agreed under pressure, told that giving up their home was for the benefit of all mankind and that the testing program would help end future wars. Refusal was never presented as a real option. They were relocated to Runit Atoll, a much smaller island with poor soil and limited fresh water. Within months, the relocated population was facing starvation. The promise of return kept getting deferred. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini Atoll, including the Castle Bravo test in 1954, a 15-megaton explosion roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Castle Bravo's yield was so far beyond what scientists had calculated that the test team itself was caught off guard by the scale of the fallout, which spread far beyond the designated danger zone and contaminated inhabited islands the U.S. had not evacuated. Bikini's residents were never told the full truth about what had been done to their home. Attempts to resettle the atoll in the 1970s failed when residents who had moved back began showing dangerously elevated levels of radioactive cesium in their bodies, absorbed through homegrown food. They were evacuated a second time in 1978. Studies conducted decades later, well into the 2000s and 2000s, continued to find radiation levels in Bikini soil exceeding international safety standards for permanent habitation. The island remains, by treaty and by science, off limits for anyone trying to live there long term, a place rendered structurally available but biologically closed. Roughly 2,000 kilometers away, a similar pattern played out on Enewetak Atoll, also part of the Marshall Islands and also used for nuclear testing throughout the same period. 43 detonations between 1948 and 1958. After testing ended, the U.S. military undertook a cleanup operation in the late 1970s that involved mixing over 100,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil and debris with cement and burying it under a concrete dome on Runit Island, one of Enewetak's islets. That structure is still there. Locals and researchers call it the Runit Dome, or sometimes more bluntly, the tomb. It was built using construction standards designed for a different climate and a different century, with no liner beneath it separating the radioactive waste from the lagoon's groundwater. Rising sea levels and increasingly intense storm activity have raised serious concern among scientists about the dome's long-term structural integrity. Nobody currently has a fully funded plan for what happens if it cracks. It's worth pausing on something here. These islands weren't abandoned because life there became inconvenient or because the population simply moved on, the way ghost towns often form around resource depletion or economic shifts. These islands were evacuated by deliberate decision for purposes decided elsewhere, by people who did not live there and were not going to bear the consequences. That distinction matters for understanding why resettlement isn't simply a matter of choice for the people whose home this used to be. Not every Pacific evacuation traces back to nuclear weapons, though. Some are quieter, slower stories, and in some ways those are stranger, because there's no single dramatic event to point to. Take Pingelap Atoll, also in Micronesia. Pingelap wasn't evacuated by a foreign government. Its population was reduced by a typhoon in the 1770s that killed roughly 90% of the island's inhabitants, leaving a population bottleneck so severe that a rare genetic condition, achromatopsia, complete color blindness, became unusually common among descendants since the surviving gene pool was so small. Pingelap is still inhabited today, but its history illustrates something important for this list. Not every emptied place stays empty by force. Some places are emptied by catastrophe, and then decades or centuries later, slowly repopulated by people willing to live with whatever the catastrophe left behind. Pingelap's population grew back. Bikinis with radioactive soil under every garden plot has not been allowed to. That contrast is the real subject of this episode, not abandonment as a single category, but the different mechanisms that keep a place empty long after the event that emptied it. It's also a useful corrective to how these stories usually get told online, where every empty place tends to get flattened into the same vague category of abandoned or forgotten, as if the cause barely matters. The cause is most of the story. A place left empty by radiation behaves nothing like a place left empty by paperwork, and a place left empty by paperwork behaves nothing like a place left empty by a shrinking supply ship schedule, even though from a satellite photo they can look identical. Consider a different kind of island evacuation. Military strategic displacement separate from weapons testing. Diego Garcia in the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean isn't technically Pacific, but the pattern is close enough in kind that researchers studying Pacific Island displacement often discuss it alongside Bikini and Enewetak. Between 1968 and 1973, the British government forcibly removed the entire Chagossian population, around 1,500 to 2,000 people, to make way for a joint UK-US military base. Residents were given little notice, limited compensation, and were resettled primarily in Mauritius and the Seychelles, often into poverty. The Chagossians were not relocated because of contamination. They were relocated because their home was geopolitically useful, and they were not. Unlike Bikini, where the land itself became physically uninhabitable, Diego Garcia remains entirely livable, green, temperate, ecologically intact. The reason no one has returned isn't radiation, it's policy. For over 50 years, legal battles over Chagossian repatriation rights moved through British courts and international tribunals with limited resolution, while the base continued operating uninterrupted. In 2025, after decades of disputes, the UK and Mauritius reached an agreement transferring sovereignty of the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius, while the United States and UK retained use of the Diego Garcia base under a long-term lease, a resolution to the sovereignty question that still left most actual Chagossians without a confirmed path home to that specific island. It's a useful contrast to hold next to Bikini. 2 islands, 2 different evacuations, 2 entirely different reasons the original residents still can't simply move back, one rooted in physical science, the other in geopolitical convenience that outlasted generations. What makes the Chagos case particularly instructive is how long the legal ambiguity was allowed to persist without resolution. International courts, including an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice in 2019, found that the UK's continued administration of the Chagos archipelago was unlawful and that decolonization had not been lawfully completed while the islands remained separated from Mauritius. That finding didn't immediately change anything on the ground. The base kept operating. Chagossians kept waiting. It took roughly another 6 years of negotiation after that opinion for the sovereignty transfer to actually happen. A reminder that even a clear legal ruling doesn't automatically translate into anyone going home. Bikini and Enewetak weren't the only Pacific islands cleared out for nuclear testing, and they weren't even the only ones cleared out by a foreign power that didn't share the consequences with the people who actually lived there. Off the northwest coast of Australia, The Montebello Islands underwent a nearly identical sequence in the early 1950s, this time under British administration rather than American. Britain conducted 3 nuclear tests at Montebello between 1952 and 1956, the first of which, codenamed Operation Hurricane, marked the country's entry into the Nuclear Weapons Club. The islands themselves were largely uninhabited at the time of testing, which is sometimes cited as a mitigating factor, but the surrounding region was not. Aboriginal communities on the nearby mainland, including indigenous pastoral workers and residents of areas downwind of the test sites, were neither evacuated nor adequately informed about fallout risk. Several British servicemen present for the test later reported health complications they attributed to radiation exposure, claims that took decades to receive any formal government acknowledgement. The islands were declared off-limits for nearly 2 decades after the final test, and radiation surveys conducted well into the 1980s and 1990s still found contamination levels too high in some areas for the original recommended exposure limits. Montebello was eventually reopened to limited visitation. It's technically possible to charter a boat there today, but permanent resettlement never happened, in part because there was no permanent population to resettle in the first place. What Montebello demonstrates is a slightly different variant of the pattern. An island doesn't need to have its residents forcibly removed to end up functionally erased. It only needs to be selected by people elsewhere as expendable. There's a third pattern worth naming, distinct from both weapons testing and military strategy: economic abandonment disguised as evacuation. Several smaller atolls across the Pacific, particularly in the outer islands of Kiribati and the Federated States of Micronesia, have seen populations leave not because of a single evacuation order, but because of a slow withdrawal of the infrastructure that made permanent habitation viable. Shipping routes that stopped servicing remote atolls, schools and clinics that closed as funding shifted toward more populous islands, and rising sea levels making freshwater lenses, the layer of fresh groundwater that sits above denser salt water beneath an atoll, increasingly saline and unreliable. These islands aren't marked by a dramatic before and after. There's no single date you can point to. What you get instead is a population graph sloping gradually towards zero across 2 or 3 decades until the last family leaves, not because they were told to, but because the island simply stopped being able to support them. This is, in some ways, the most quietly unsettling pattern of the 3, because it has no clear villain, no single decision you can hold up for accountability. It's the result of dozens of smaller decisions made far away, none individually decisive, that together produce the same outcome as a forced evacuation, an island with buildings still standing and nobody left inside them. So why do these places stay empty decades on instead of being resettled? For Bikini and Enewetak, the answer is mostly biological. The islands are not yet considered safe by international radiological standards, and the cost of fully remediating contaminated soil across multiple islets has been judged by successive U.S. administrations not worth the expense relative to the small population that would benefit. For Diego Garcia, the answer is almost entirely political. A strategic military asset, once established, tends to generate its own institutional momentum that's very hard to reverse, regardless of the legal or moral claims against it. For the slow abandonment atolls, the answer is economic. Once the infrastructure supporting a remote population is gone, rebuilding it for a tiny number of returning residents rarely clears the bar of cost effectiveness for the governments responsible. 3 different mechanisms, 3 different kinds of silence, but the same basic shape. A decision made by people who didn't live on the island, with consequences borne by people who did, for far longer than anyone originally promised. What ties all of these places together isn't tragedy in the abstract sense, it's specificity. Bikini's residents were told it would be temporary. Enewetak's were left next to a structure no one fully accounts for in long-term planning. The Chagossians were given weeks to pack. The outer island families watched the supply ship's schedule shrink from monthly to occasional to never. These aren't ruins in the way we usually picture them. vine-covered temples, dust-choked main streets. Many of these islands look almost ready for people to walk back into them tomorrow. Houses with intact roofs, coral-paved roads, in some cases generators that could, in theory, still run. What's missing isn't the infrastructure of a life. It's permission, safety, or simple economic logic. 3 different locks on 3 different doors, all keeping the same kind of homecoming from happening. It's tempting to file all of this under history night, decisions made decades ago by governments that no longer exist in the same form, under doctrines that have since been revised or repudiated. But the mechanisms that produce these empty islands are still active. Military basing agreements still get negotiated without the people living on the land in question. Remediation budgets still get weighed against population size in ways that leave small communities permanently on the losing side of the math. Remote infrastructure still gets quietly withdrawn long before anyone holds a press conference to announce it. None of the islands in this list are mysteries. There's no missing explanation, no gap in the record that invites speculation. Every one of them has a file somewhere, a treaty, a military order, a budget line that simply stopped being renewed. That's arguably what makes them worth examining at all. Not what we don't know, but how plainly the document reasons sit next to the outcome, and how little that documentation ever did for the people who had to live with it. The tide keeps doing what it has always done, rising, falling, indifferent to whatever paperwork decided who gets to live here. The houses are still standing. The doors are unlocked. Nobody's coming back.